Sicily, choosing a pleasant route to pedal with a bike is a titanic challenge, not because there is a lack of cycle options here, quite the opposite. There are too many interesting routes because the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Arabs, the Normans, the Swabians, the Angevins, and the Spanish passed through this island, and each has left some footprint. Sicily is like wine, because wine is the result of centuries of traditions and contains the colors, smells, and flavors of the land that generated it. It shouldn't be drunk, it should be tasted. Wine is contemplation. And this is Sicily. Here you must never be in a hurry. You need to get in tune with the island to understand and appreciate it. Our Sicilian tasting begins with the Via dei Tramonti from Palermo to Agrigento and with the return through the hinterland along the Magna Via Francigena. Having landed in Palermo, in the ancient neighborhood that has always hosted those who assemble, sell, and repair bikes, we find hospitality in a warehouse to reassemble our vehicles, ready for use in the days that follow.
Vai!
What can be said about Palermo? It is a mixture of Baroque beauty and decadence with that set of cultures that have found refuge in its neighborhoods for centuries. You could lose entire days wandering around its markets, such as that of Borgo Vecchio, or better yet, the historical market of Ballarò, which, according to the people of Palermo, is more than 1,000 years, and which betrays its multicultural vocation thanks to the writings in Italian, Arabic, and Hebrew. Or like the very popular Vucceria market, which when you walk through it almost seems to be a souk in a Muslim city. It would take weeks to familiarize yourself with the culture of the city, which according to UNESCO is the largest historic center in Europe. With the cathedral, whose work began as early as 1600, then converted into a mosque, then destroyed and rebuilt, and once again a Catholic cathedral. And the two splendid churches that face each other in Piazza Bellini, that of Santa Maria dell'Ammiraglio in Norman style, and that of San Cataldo with Arab architecture, but at the service of Christianity. Unmissable is the fountain of shame, so called because of the shamelessly sculpted statues without veils. And the Piazza dei Quattro Canti, also known as the Teatro del Sole, because during the day, at least one of the four architectural views is in full light kissed by the sun's rays. For us, however, kilometer zero of the journey is represented by the Lanza Tomasi Palace, the home of Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa, author of the book Il Gatto Pardo, and later I will explain why. Anyway, Sicilian wine is good, but I've always drunk beer, so a lucky cap goes to its post, and we reach the exit from Palermo to give life to our Sicilian tarantella, pedaling leaving the sea on our right. And so, after a few dozen kilometers, we begin to glimpse a small island called the Island of Females, which, according to local traditions, in ancient times, was a prison occupied only and exclusively by women. In a few kilometers you pass through Terrasini with its beautiful historic center, perfect time for lunch break, and here you eat well. I think at the end of the trip we will have gained a couple of kilos. A nice ride serves to work off lunch, and always keeping the sea on our right for about 30 kilometers, we arrive in the afternoon at Castellammare del Golfo, where the ancient Norman Arab castle, dating back to the 10th century, seems to have been placed there to act as a guardian at the entrance to the port. That's enough for us for today. We leave Castellammare del Golfo early in the morning, heading towards the western end of the island. Once upon a time, this was an area of important traps, such as the famous one in Scopello. As a tuna fishery, it has been out of use for some time, but has been recovered for tourism as a luxury resort. Then it climbs hard, up to the Baida Castle, of which there are traces since the 13th century. Today, it is said that it has been transformed into a farm, although as we pass it seems completely deserted, with the only signs of life being a few dogs and the chirping of birds. We follow some isolated and little-traveled roads that take us towards the coast, until we take a cycle path that leads us to the Bonaggia tuna fishery. This too has been transformed into a resort, but outside the walls, some old and battered vaschedu, the typical tuna boats, tell us about the very hard life of the fishermen. And on a wall of the marina, a sign reports the words of Federico II of Swabia: "I don't envy God paradise because I am very satisfied with living in Sicily." Still following the cycle path after a few kilometers, right at the gates of Trapani, there are the ruins of another tuna factory, the Tipa tuna factory, which remained in operation until the early 1960s, but which, despite a wonderful view of the sea, now lies in state of complete abandonment. Such a pity. Once past the old Trapani, our destination is the ancient salt pans, south of the city, from which you can glimpse the Agadi Islands in the distance. The salt pans have existed since the time of the Phoenicians in the 5th century BC. We also find mention of salt pans in some Arabic manuscripts, but it was with the Aragonese that the Trapani salt industry established itself. Then, over the centuries, there have been moments of great crisis and moments of great splendor. And it must be said that despite the alternating fortunes, the salt pans are still in operation today. Now, if you go there at the right time of year, if you have a good telephoto lens with you, a tripod, and if you also have a fair amount of luck, you can bring home images of some pink flamingos. In the absence of all this, as an interesting alternative, you can always have a happy hour on the salt flats while waiting for the sunset. The next stage, starting at sunrise, takes us to the island of Mozia, inside the Stagnone Reserve, where we arrive via a cycle path and a short boat trip. For 500 years, the island was a Phoenician colony, until 397 BC when the Syracusans destroyed it. Then it remained uninhabited for centuries, until it was purchased by an English nobleman towards the end of the 19th century, and today it is home to an important Phoenician museum. The road then takes us towards Marsala, the city, which gives its name to the famous wine and whose vineyards escort us to the entrance of the wonderful Florio cellars, where Marsala wine is born. Sicilian? Maybe not. The story goes that a rich Liverpool merchant, a certain John Woodhouse, landed with his brig during a storm at the port of Marsala to find shelter. In the following days, wandering among the taverns, he had the opportunity to taste a rather particular wine taken from local vineyards, which he liked very much. So he decided to ship around 50 barrels to England, and to avoid it being ruined during the crossing, he decided to add around 2% of brandy. The wine took on a flavor that closely resembled port wine. The wine, elaborated in this way, was initially distributed by Woodhouse, and only afterwards did Mr. Florio to produce it on a large scale and decree its definitive success. Leaving the Florio cellars, we venture on a gravel route up to Mazara del Vallo, where, in a museum, it is possible to admire perhaps the most famous Hellenic sculpture in the whole of Sicily, that of the dancing satyr. Here in Mazara, it is easy to get lost in the streets of its Arab neighborhood, a real kasbah, founded by Tunisian fishermen more than 1,000 years ago. And in fact, an ancient fish market still exists here. Maybe it's because of the smell of the market or the moored fishing boats. Our appetite leads us to try the most typical dish of Mazara.
Che si prende? Couscous.
Then, in order to avoid traveling along busy state roads, we lengthen the route a bit, following the coast that takes us to the Capo Granitola lighthouse, and finally, still along internal roads, up to the entrance to the Chiusa quarries, where the columns for the temples of Selinunte were sculpted. The site was quickly abandoned during the destruction of the city, and these unfinished and abandoned blocks for 2,000 years seem almost as if they wanted to pop out of the rock on their own. Last trip to get to the town of Marinella, where the archaeological site of Selinunte stands, and where we have a privileged appointment at the entrance to the site early in the morning. Selinunte is an extraordinary archaeological park, among other things the largest in Europe. The town took its name from wild celery, whose plants still grow among the ruins today. Despite the importance it reached at the moment of its maximum splendor, it seems to have had more than 100,000 inhabitants. It was short-lived. After just over 2.5 centuries, it was in fact almost completely destroyed by the Carthaginians in 409 BC. The city then remained uninhabited in the centuries to come, except for a few brief and sporadic settlements. The final blow was inflicted by a very violent earthquake which, in the Byzantine era, reduced its monuments to a pile of ruins. But the locals also contributed to the despoliation of its ruins, using the remains as quarries for stone. The area includes 7 temples. Of some, only the ruins remain. Others have been the subject of restoration. For others, important interventions are planned in the coming years to restore the entire area. But even while waiting for further restorations, the visit is extremely suggestive. Our Sicilian tarantella continues eastwards. The next destination is the city of Sciacca, a city that perhaps has more churches than inhabitants, a long tradition of majolica and an infinite series of alleys overlooked by brightly colored houses that are sometimes in a state of abandonment. Not far from the port, there is a curious open-air museum. It is the site of a perennial pilgrimage, and where you can see hundreds of heads carved into the rock by a very imaginative artist. And we always continue with the wheels turned towards the sunrise, always looking for alternative routes that keep us away from the state roads, like the one that leads us near the town of Eraclea Minoia, where we find remains that still testify to the Phoenician presence on site. Remains placed there a few meters away from a splendid cliff overlooking the sea. The cliff, at dawn, lapped by a very calm, almost fake sea, offers us a priceless spectacle before we proceed in the direction of Agrigento, where the so-called Via dei Tramonti will end. And we, still following secondary roads, undertake a gravel stretch that crosses the Pantano Nature Reserve, where we are greeted by an explosion of colors that accompany us throughout the entire journey on a beautiful white road. Pantano in Italian means swamp, a perfect name, and in fact we fill ourselves completely with mud. Once we've removed some of the dirt from our bike shoes, we can set off again. On the right, it is impossible not to stop and admire the Scala dei Turchi, a bright white cliff which once offered shelter to Saracen pirates, that is, Turks, and hence the name. And finally, before visiting the Valley of the Temples, we make a short stop in Porto Empedocle, where Pirandello lived, and also Andrea Camilleri, to whom the inhabitants have dedicated a bronze statue to his most famous character, Inspector Montalbano. With Lorenzo, a longtime friend, we cover the few kilometers that separate Porto Empedocle from the Valley of the Temples, which is perhaps the best-known archaeological site in the whole of Sicily. Here you can admire a series of Greek temples in perfect Doric style, which belong to what remains of the ancient city of Akragas, what is today known as Agrigento. Like other Greek settlements in Sicily, the city had moments of great splendor. Then, between wars and rivalries, it lost its importance and became depopulated. As evidence of its greatness, in addition to the temples and the agora, there are also a long series of necropolises from various Greek, Roman, and early Christian eras. But the most representative part of the park are, without a doubt, the splendidly preserved remains of the impressive Temple of Concordia, probably one of the greatest expressions of Hellenic culture, as well as the most photographed monument in all of Sicily. Even today it is not clear who it was dedicated to, which, all in all, is probably not of great importance. If you happen to be in these parts, my advice is to stay until late, when the stones of the temple turn into truly evocative shades as the sun goes down. From Agrigento we set off towards Palermo to cross the hinterland along the Magna Via Francigena. A dangerous detour, not even reported, takes us to the Macalube White Eye, some form of volcanic phenomenon. According to Guy de Maupassant in his book Journey to Sicily, volcanoes would be a horrible soil infection. while his colleague Adolfo Holm, in History of Sicily in Antiquity, writes, "The mud volcano Macaluba is one of the greatest wonders of Sicily. I don't express myself, this is what we found. Judge for yourself." And here is Sicily, the one you don't expect. Along the Magna Via Francigena, the panorama changes completely, at times taking on a soft and hilly appearance. Only the scorching heat does not change. That heat that made the character of the prince in the book Il Gattopardo say, "This climate that inflicts 6 months of fever at 40 degrees on us, May, June, July, August, September, October, 6 times 30 days of sun overhanging your heads. This summer, as long as the Russian winter." In each of those months, if a Sicilian worked seriously, he would spend the energy that should be enough for 3 people. And believe me, when you try these temperatures, it's hard to blame them. In Ficuzza, we come across the royal hunting lodge of Bourbon King Ferdinand III, and not far away, after a short walk in the Ficuzza woods, we find a rock called the King's Pulpit, a stone worked like a throne, and from where the Bourbons lingered on the panorama of the valley that leads to Corleone, a city perched on the hill, with its streets perpetually downhill or uphill, depending on your point of view and where the heat makes prickly pears grow even in the gutters. We would like to blend in with the population, but it is useless. A flat cap does not make a true Sicilian. So, as authentic tourists, we waste a few minutes at the Corleone waterfalls, one of the secret jewels of Sicily. We would have reached the end of the journey. We have passed the Via dei Tramonti and the short Magna Via Francigena, and all we have to do is get to where we started from. But we still have 2 things to do before we board the plane home: being children again for a while, and after visiting the Puppet Museum, being able to immerse ourselves in the stories of Rinaldo Angelica and the paladins of France. And finally, enjoying an arancina. Because elsewhere in Italy, you can also say arancino, but not in Palermo. The arancina is female. Remember that.